The lawyer found her shoes first. Two black flats sitting neatly by the front door of a $4.2 million Rosedale home, placed side by side the way someone does when they know they're never coming back. Then the note on the kitchen island, 3 words written in perfect cursive on the back of a grocery receipt. Check the cloud. 48 hours later, one of Toronto's most respected surgeons would be sitting in a police interrogation room, and the woman everyone assumed was too broken to fight back would be dismantling his life from a basement apartment in Montreal. But this story doesn't begin with the escape. It begins with coffee. Simone Adeyemi poured Ethiopian roast into a handmade ceramic mug at 6:14 on a Tuesday morning while her husband reviewed patient files at their kitchen table. The Rosedale townhouse smelled of fresh grounds and furniture polish and something else underneath both of those things, something that had no scent but a weight. Dread. It lived in the walls of that house the way moisture lives in old basements, invisible, constant, slowly rotting everything it touched. Graham didn't look up when she placed the mug beside his elbow. He never did. Acknowledging a gesture would mean acknowledging the person who made it. And Simone had stopped being a person in his eyes sometime around year 2 of their marriage. She'd become a system. A collection of tasks that either functioned correctly or required correction. The correction was always physical. She stood 3 steps behind his chair, waiting to be dismissed or summoned, her bare feet silent on heated porcelain tile. The bruise along her left ribcage throbbed with each breath, hidden beneath a cashmere sweater she'd pulled from the drawer he designated for home clothes. Graham organized everything, her wardrobe, her schedule, her contacts, the precise angle at which hand towels were folded in the guest bathroom. The Greenberg file is wrong, he said. Not to her, at her. The way someone speaks to a thermostat that won't hold temperature. I can call your office and have Diana check it. Diana is incompetent. Everyone around me is incompetent. His jaw tightened. Simone recognized the shift, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the way his fingers pressed harder against the paper. Something at the hospital had gone sideways and she was the only surface available to absorb the impact. The board rejected my funding proposal. He said it the way other men might announce a death in the family. 3 years of research, exposed to a committee of administrators who couldn't differentiate between a scalpel and a steak knife. Simone kept her expression neutral. She'd learned to read these moments like weather systems, the atmospheric pressure drop before a storm, the stillness that came before something broke. I'm sorry, Graham, are you? It wasn't a question. He turned in his chair and his hand found her wrist before she could step back. His grip was precise. He was a surgeon, after all. He knew exactly how much pressure to apply before bone began to protest. You know what I find fascinating about failure, Simone? It's contagious. I come home to a wife who can't remember to buy the right coffee filters, who can't maintain a single friendship without embarrassing me, who exists in my house like some kind of ornamental plant that I have to water and trim and apologize for when company comes over. His thumb pressed into the soft tissue on the inside of her wrist, finding the bruise from Thursday. She didn't flinch. Flinching made it worse. You're going to cancel dinner with Nadine tonight. Her stomach dropped. Nadine Bouchard was the only person left who still called, who still texted thinking of you on random afternoons, who hadn't been successfully driven away by Graham's campaign of social isolation. Nadine was also a criminal defense lawyer with an office on Rue Saint-Denis in Montreal, a detail Graham had never bothered to learn because he'd never bothered to learn anything about Simone's life before him. She's only in Toronto for one night, and I need you here. For what she knew better than to ask, the need was never specific, it was about availability, about knowing she was where he'd placed her reachable, controllable, contained. A surgical instrument returned to its designated tray. I'll text her now. Good. He released her wrist and returned to his files as though nothing had happened. And iron my navy suit. The Rotary dinner is Thursday. You'll smile. You'll talk about the garden. You'll tell the Hendersons that we're trying for children and that I'm a wonderful husband. Can you manage that? She could manage anything. She'd been managing for 4 years. Managing the way soldiers manage in foxholes. Through dissociation, through ritual, through the private knowledge that every act of submission was also an act of documentation. Because what Graham Pierce didn't know, what the brilliant, meticulous, controlling Graham Pierce had never once suspected, was that his ornamental wife had been building a case against him since their 2nd anniversary, and the woman he'd just ordered her to cancel on was the one helping her do it. When his Audi pulled out of the driveway 15 minutes later, Simone moved to the upstairs linen closet. Behind a stack of guest towels he never touched sat a prepaid phone purchased with cash from a Shoppers Drug Mart in Scarborough. She powered it on and typed one message. Thursday. After the dinner. I'll have the last recording. Nadine's reply came in 9 seconds. Everything's ready on this end. Have you ever had to perform love for someone who used it as a weapon? Have you ever counted the steps to the nearest exit in your own home? This is the story of a woman who did both every single day, until the day she stopped performing and started fighting. Simone Adeyemi arrived in Toronto at 23 with a master's degree in social work from Dalhousie, and the kind of optimism that comes from never having been truly hurt by someone who claimed to love her. She'd grown up in Halifax, the daughter of Nigerian immigrants who ran a tailoring shop on Gottingen Street, and spoke to each other in Yoruba when they didn't want their children to understand the bills. Her father pressed suits with the same care he pressed his children's futures, firm, deliberate with complete faith that pressure created something beautiful. She met Graham at a fundraiser for Sick Kids Hospital. He was 41, separated, donating enough money to have his name engraved on a hallway. She was 27, working intake at a women's shelter in Parkdale, wearing a borrowed dress and wondering why the shrimp cocktail was arranged on mirrors. He found her standing alone near the coat check, reading emails on her phone.
"You look like you'd rather be somewhere else,"
he said. "I'd rather be useful," she answered. He laughed. At the time it sounded like delight. Later she'd understand it was something else. The sound a collector makes when he spots something rare in a discount bin. Their courtship was a masterclass in manufactured intimacy. Weekend trips to Niagara on the lake. Handwritten notes left on her car windshield. A first edition copy of Toni Morrison's Beloved, that he'd somehow known was her favorite. He listened with a surgeon's attention, cataloging everything she said, not because he cared about her, but because information was the foundation of control. The first hit came 4 months after the wedding, delivered with the back of his hand across her cheekbone, because she'd spoken to a male colleague at a hospital gala. He apologized within the hour, bought her a Cartier bracelet the next morning, explained with the calm authority of a man accustomed to being believed, that his jealousy was evidence of how deeply he loved her. Simone knew better. She'd spent 3 years working in shelters. She'd held the hands of women who told her the exact same story with different names and different bracelets. She knew the cycle: tension, explosion, honeymoon, repeat, the way a meteorologist knows storm patterns. She could diagram it on a whiteboard. But knowing the pattern and escaping the pattern are two different things. Graham controlled the money. He monitored her phone. He'd systematically alienated her from everyone except Nadine. And even that friendship survived only because Nadine was stubborn enough to keep calling and smart enough to use a number Graham didn't know about. What Graham never understood, because men like Graham never understand this, was that Simone's training wasn't a weakness. It was a weapon. She didn't just recognize the cycle, she documented it. Every bruise photographed with date stamps on the prepaid phone. Every threatening voicemail saved to an encrypted cloud account Nadine had set up. Every hospital visit, the ones she'd explained away as clumsiness, as falling downstairs, as walking into doors, recorded in a private file with the names of attending physicians who might later be called as witnesses. She'd been building an evidence portfolio with the same methodical patience Graham used to prepare for surgery, and like surgery the execution would need to be precise, because leaving was the most dangerous moment in any abusive relationship. Simone had sat with women who tried to leave and were found. She knew the statistics, she knew the obituaries hidden inside those statistics, so she stayed. And she documented, and she waited for the moment when the evidence was overwhelming and the exit route was clear. That moment arrived on a Thursday evening in October, 45 minutes before the Rotary dinner. When Graham came home from the hospital in a mood that made the air in the house contract. The disciplinary hearing had not gone well. A junior resident had filed a formal complaint about Graham's behavior in the operating room, his verbal abuse, his throwing of instruments, the incident where he'd grabbed a nurse's arm hard enough to leave marks. The hospital's chief of staff had used words like mandatory leave and anger management assessment, and liability. Graham walked through the front door and Simone felt the temperature drop. "The suit," he said. "It's hanging in the bedroom, the cuff links, on the dresser." He moved toward her with the deliberate gait of someone who'd already decided what was going to happen. She was standing in the kitchen, and the island was between them, and for one breath she thought about running. "Do you know what happened today?" His voice was quiet. That was the worst register. The one that meant the violence would be calculated, rather than explosive. Graham, a 26-year-old resident who couldn't close a chest cavity without supervision, decided that she knew better than I did about professional conduct. He was around the island now. She could smell his cologne and the antiseptic underneath. A child, lecturing me. His hands found her shoulders, thumbs pressing into the hollows above her collarbones. Not hard enough to bruise visibly. Never where the dress wouldn't cover. I gave that hospital 14 years of my career. I've saved more lives than the entire administrative board combined. And this is what I get. Questioned by a resident who couldn't find a vein with a map and a flashlight? The pressure increased. Simone felt her knees buckle slightly but kept her feet. Maybe we should skip the dinner, she said, offering him an out. A chance to drink bourbon alone in the study instead of performing for an audience. His reaction was instantaneous. The shove sent her backwards into the counter, the edge catching her lower back with the kind of sharp blinding pain that takes a full second to register. She caught herself on the counter and stayed upright, vision swimming, while Graham adjusted his tie in the hallway mirror. "We're going to the dinner," he said to his own reflection. "You're going to smile, you're going to tell people I'm brilliant. Tomorrow morning you're going to wake up and make my coffee, and we're going to pretend this conversation didn't happen, because that's what marriage is. That's what partnership looks like." He left the kitchen. Simone waited until she heard his footsteps on the stairs before reaching beneath the fruit bowl on the counter and pressing stop on the voice recorder she'd placed there that morning. 4 years of recordings. 600 photographs. Medical records from 3 emergency departments across the GTA. Financial documents showing how he'd moved her name off every account and asset within the first year of marriage. And now a freshly recorded admission of workplace violence that would corroborate the hospital's disciplinary file. That night, at the Rotary dinner, Simone smiled at the Hendersons. She talked about the garden. She told a charming anecdote about Graham's dedication to his patients that made 3 people laugh, and one woman lean over and whisper, "You are so lucky." And while Graham shook hands and accepted compliments, and performed the version of himself he wanted the world to see, Simone excused herself to the washroom and sent every file. 4 years of evidence compressed into encrypted folders, to Nadine's secure server in Montreal. Then she went back to the table and ordered dessert. She left at 4 a.m. not in tears, not in chaos. With a single carry-on bag she'd packed in stages over 6 weeks, cached in a locker at Union Station, her wedding ring placed on the kitchen island beside a note, "Check the cloud." The cloud was Graham's own iCloud account, the one she'd accessed using the password he kept taped inside his desk drawer because brilliant men often have spectacularly stupid security habits. She'd uploaded a single file to his photo stream, a 30-second video of him shoving her into the kitchen counter, captured by the small camera she'd installed inside the smoke detector he never once checked. She wanted him to find it. She wanted him to know that she'd been watching him the way he'd watched her, with precision, with patience, and with the understanding that documentation was the most powerful weapon a person without power could possess. By 6 a.m., Simone was on a Via Rail train heading east. By noon, she was sitting in Nadine Bouchard's office on Rue Saint-Denis, signing documents that would end her marriage and begin the legal process of holding Graham Pierce accountable for every single thing he'd done behind the walls of that beautiful Rosedale house. Have you ever walked away from a life that looked perfect on the outside but was killing you on the inside? Have you ever been told you were lucky by someone who had no idea what you survived to sit at that table? Graham woke at 6:15 to silence. No coffee, no footsteps, no Simone. He found the ring in the note and felt the first emotion he'd experienced in years that wasn't anger or contempt. It was fear, not fear for Simone, fear for himself, fear of what it meant that his perfectly calibrated system, his wife, his household, his controlled environment, had malfunctioned without his permission. He called her phone. Disconnected. He checked the tracking app he'd installed on her device. No signal. He drove to the shelter where she used to work. Closed. He called her parents in Halifax. Her father answered in Yoruba, then switched to English long enough to say, "We have nothing to say to you, Dr. Pierce," before hanging up. By afternoon, Graham checked his iCloud and found the video. His hands didn't shake. Surgeons' hands don't shake. But something behind his eyes did. He watched himself on screen, watched the shove, heard his own voice delivering threats with the calm precision he used to describe surgical procedures. And he understood in the clinical way he understood all things, that he was looking at evidence. What he didn't understand yet was the scope. The letter from Nadine's firm arrived by courier the following Monday. It was 9 pages long and read like an autopsy report on his character. Attached were 147 photographs with dates and timestamps. 16 audio recordings totaling 43 hours. Medical records from North York General, Sunnybrook and Mount Sinai that formed a pattern no judge could misinterpret, and a detailed filing with the Ontario College of Physicians and Surgeons, requesting an investigation into Dr. Graham Pierce's fitness to practice. The genius of Simone's plan, the part that made Nadine describe it as the most airtight domestic violence case she'd ever seen, was that it didn't require Simone to testify. The evidence spoke for itself. Video, audio, medical records, Graham's own handwritten notes about corrective measures, found in his study desk, notes he'd kept the way he kept surgical logs, documenting his methods with professional detachment. The disciplinary complaint from the hospital resident arrived at the college on the same day as Nadine's filing. The timing wasn't coincidental. Nadine had spent 3 months coordinating with the hospital's legal team, with victim advocacy organizations across Ontario, with a forensic accountant who traced how Graham had used joint assets to fund surveillance equipment installed throughout the house. Graham hired a lawyer, then fired him. Hired another. The second lawyer reviewed the evidence package, excused herself to the hallway, and came back with the expression of someone who'd just been asked to defend a sinking ship using a paper cup. "Dr. Pierce, I'm going to be direct with you. This evidence is comprehensive. If this goes to criminal trial, and based on what I'm seeing it will, you're looking at assault charges, criminal harassment charges, and depending on how the Crown frames the financial control, potentially trafficking adjacent charges under the new coercive control legislation. She's my wife. She's your victim, and she built a case against you that most prosecutors would need a team of investigators and 18 months to assemble. She did it alone, from inside your house, while you were hurting her." The college suspended his license pending investigation. The hospital placed him on indefinite leave. A reporter from the Toronto Star called his office asking for comment on a story about a prominent GTA surgeon facing allegations of prolonged domestic violence. Someone, Graham never found out who, had sent the newsroom a summary of the evidence with enough detail to be damning and enough redaction to be legal. Within 2 weeks, the man who'd controlled every element of his wife's existence couldn't control anything. Not his reputation, not the narrative, not the slowly tightening circle of legal consequences that Simone and Nadine had spent 4 years constructing. The arrest happened at the hospital. 2 plainclothes officers from Toronto Police Service's Intimate Partner Violence Unit walked into his office at 10 a.m. on a Wednesday and informed him that he was being charged with 12 counts of assault, 4 counts of assault causing bodily harm, criminal harassment and coercive control under the recently amended Criminal Code. Graham stood up from his desk, looked at the officers and said, "This is a misunderstanding." It was not a misunderstanding. The trial lasted 11 days. Simone did not attend. She didn't need to. Her evidence filled the courtroom like a second presence, her voice on recordings, her body in photographs, her pain translated into exhibits labeled A through ZZZ. The Crown prosecutor played one recording for the jury that lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. In it, Graham described, in his calm surgical voice, exactly what he would do to Simone if she ever told anyone about their private life. He listed her parents, her friends, her career. He described how he would use his connections at the hospital to have her declared mentally unstable. He described how he would ensure that no one believed her, because who would believe a social worker over a surgeon? The jury was out for 3 hours. They came back with guilty on all counts. Justice Liu's sentencing remarks took 20 minutes, but one passage circulated widely afterward. "Dr. Pierce, you used your intelligence, your status, and your medical knowledge to systematically terrorize a woman who had committed no offense other than trusting you. You weaponized intimacy. You treated your marriage as a laboratory for control, and you underestimated your wife so profoundly that you never once noticed she was documenting your cruelty with the same precision you brought to your surgeries. The court sentences you to 9 years in federal custody." Graham stood motionless as the sentence was read. His lawyer touched his arm and he flinched. It was a small movement, involuntary, the kind of reflexive response that comes from sudden unexpected contact. For the first time in his adult life, Graham Pierce understood what it felt like to flinch. Have you ever watched someone who thought they were untouchable discover that accountability doesn't care about titles or tax brackets? Simone watched the verdict on her laptop from a small apartment in Montreal's Plateau neighborhood. Nadine sat beside her holding 2 mugs of tea that were getting cold. Neither of them spoke for a long time. "How do you feel?" Nadine asked. Simone thought about the question. She expected to feel triumph, or relief, or at least the satisfaction of a plan executed perfectly. Instead, she felt something quieter, a loosening, like a fist that had been clenched for 4 years finally opening. "I feel like I can breathe without counting the seconds until he comes home." In the months that followed, Simone did something that surprised everyone who knew her story. She went back to work. Not at a shelter. She wasn't ready to sit across from women in crisis and pretend she had all the answers. Instead, she partnered with Nadine's firm to build something new. The Adeyemi Center opened on a Tuesday in March, in a converted row house in Park Extension, one of Montreal's most diverse neighborhoods. It wasn't a shelter. It was a documentation hub, a place where women in abusive relationships could learn how to build evidence safely, securely, and legally while still living inside the danger. Simone designed the program based on everything she'd done wrong and everything she'd done right during her 4 years with Graham. She taught women how to use encrypted apps, how to photograph injuries with proper timestamps, how to save voicemails without the abuser knowing, how to build a legal file that could survive scrutiny. The system tells women to leave. Simone explained to a journalist from La Presse during the center's opening week. But it doesn't tell them how to leave safely, and it doesn't tell them how to make sure the person who hurt them faces consequences after they're gone. We do both. Within the first year, the center helped 43 women build evidence portfolios. 31 of those women eventually left their abusers. 22 criminal cases were brought to trial using documentation gathered through the center's methods. 19 resulted in convictions. Nadine handled the legal side, pro bono consultations, referrals to criminal lawyers, coordination with victim services. She was fierce and tireless and swore in both languages when judges granted bail to men who clearly shouldn't have been trusted with freedom. Simone handled the human side. She sat with women who were afraid. She held hands that were shaking. She said the thing that nobody had ever said to her. You are not crazy, you are not overreacting, and you do not have to decide anything today except whether you want to start keeping records. The center became a model. Simone was invited to speak at conferences. She consulted with police services in Ottawa and Vancouver on how to improve evidence collection in intimate partner violence cases. The Ontario government cited her methodology in new training guidelines for Crown prosecutors. She never once mentioned Graham's name in public. She didn't need to. The court records were public. The news coverage was searchable. His story existed in the world without her having to carry it. 14 months into his sentence, Graham sent a letter to the center. It was addressed to Simone but opened by Nadine, who read it twice, then set it on her desk and stared at the wall for a long time. The letter was not an apology. Not exactly. It was something more unsettling, an inventory. Graham had written, in his precise handwriting, a detailed account of every act of violence he could remember committing against his wife. Dates, locations, descriptions. The letter read like a surgical log, each entry clinical and specific, stripped of emotion but heavy with the accumulated weight of 4 years of brutality. At the bottom he'd written, I am using the skills I have, precision and documentation, to do the only useful thing left available to me. If this record helps other professionals identify patterns they might otherwise miss, it will be the first genuinely beneficial thing I've produced in years. Nadine showed the letter to Simone. Simone read it in silence, folded it and placed it in a drawer. Do you want to respond? Nadine asked. No. Do you want to use it? The documentation methodology, the pattern analysis, it could genuinely be useful for our training materials. Simone considered this for a long time. Yes, she said, use it, redact his name. The patterns matter more than the person. She was right, the patterns did matter. Graham's letter, stripped of identifying details, became part of the center's training curriculum. Psychologists used his self-analysis to help frontline workers understand how abusers rationalize violence. How they frame control as care, how they convince themselves that precision makes cruelty acceptable. What Graham never learned, because Simone never told him, and because some truths are gifts that abusers don't deserve, was that when she left the Rosedale house at 4 a.m., with a single carry-on bag, she was not alone. She was 6 weeks pregnant. Her daughter was born in Montreal in July, in a birthing center where the midwife spoke French and the windows faced a park full of maple trees. Nadine was in the room. Simone's mother flew in from Halifax and cried all too hard. The midwife brought her a chair and a glass of water. Simone named her Adèse. It means daughter of a king in Igbo, but Simone chose it for a different reason. It means princess. And in the Adeyemi family, princesses didn't wait to be rescued. They built their own castles and installed their own locks and kept the keys in places no one would ever think to look. Adèse took her first steps in the hallway of the center, surrounded by women who clapped and cheered and cried, because watching a child learn to walk in a place built from survival felt like proof that the world could still produce something beautiful from something broken. Simone never told Graham about Adèse. She didn't owe him that knowledge. She didn't owe him anything. What she owed, to herself, to her daughter, to every woman who walked through the center's front door with fear in her eyes and evidence on her phone, was the truth that survival isn't just about escaping. It's about building something afterward that makes the escape mean something. 3 years after the verdict, a young woman walked into the Adeyemi Center on a Tuesday morning. She was 24. She had a bruise on her collarbone hidden under a turtleneck in July. She sat across from Simone and said, I don't know if I'm ready to leave, but I need someone to believe me. Simone poured her a cup of Ethiopian roast from the carafe she kept on her desk, the same beans she'd once served in a $4.2 million kitchen to a man who never said thank you, and set it down gently. I believe you. And whenever you're ready, we'll make sure the evidence speaks louder than he ever could. The young woman wrapped both hands around the warm mug and, for the first time in months, exhaled. Some stories end with a villain in prison. This one ends with a woman pouring coffee. Not because she was told to, but because she chose to. Because choosing who receives your kindness is the purest form of freedom there is. and because the best thing you can build from the ruins of someone else's cruelty isn't revenge. It's a door that other women can walk through when they're ready, at their own pace, in their own time, carrying whatever evidence they've gathered in whatever hiding place they've found. If this story reminded you of someone you know, share it with them. Not with advice, not with judgment, just with the quiet message that someone out there built a door, and it's still open.